In this tutorial, we're going to walk through some basic steps for getting started using SketchUp. We'll go over some very basic tools, create a small model, apply some materials to that model, and bring in a few objects from the 3D warehouse. We'll also then create some shadows and scenes and talk about exporting those as a JPEG. Anytime you open up SketchUp, it's going to give you the option to open some recent files, but also just create a new model, and that's what we're going to do here. We've got a lot of different templates. I'm just going to choose architectural and inches by clicking on that icon right there. It'll open up our interface, and oftentimes you're going to see this axis here. This is called our origin, and we'll have a person that's brought in here. You'll notice that I've got some toolbars, and I'm working in the Mac version here. But you can right-click up in space, go to Customize Toolbars. Gives you a bunch of different options to sort of drag and drop up into your toolbar. A few that I like to have open are these standard views, as well as some different ways to view the model in terms of its line work. We've got shadows to toggle on and off, and then just our basic tools. Now you'll also see that I'll have this toolbar here, and you can access it by going to View, Tool Palettes, and Large Tool Set. So it's got a few duplicates up here, but it's got a more expansive use of tools that I like to click on, in particular being able to place a person, walk around in the model, and look around as well. To get started though, for this model, we're going to use one of the basic tools up here. This is a shape tool, and if you click this little down arrow, you'll see that there are a few different shape tools. We're going to keep it on rectangle, and I'm just going to create a rectangle on the ground right in front of our person here. So we'll click once, and then we'll release and start moving our mouse in the direction that we want to create this shape, and of course creating it flat on the ground here. You'll see down on the bottom right you've got dimensions for the size of that, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to type in 24 inches, comma 24 inches, and what that means is 2 feet in both directions. I'll hit enter right there to create that. Now I'm going to use my second tool right here, which is the push-pull tool. I'm going to click on this surface. I click right in the middle of it and move my mouse up, and what this is going to allow me to do is start to project in this direction. Now again, you can see in the bottom right what that distance is going to be, but again I'm just going to type 20 inches and hit enter, and I know that it's going to move 20 inches up. I'll then move to the next tool across our toolbar. This is going to be the offset tool. What the offset tool allows me to do is actually click on this face right here. I'm clicking in the center. I can either offset in or offset out. Again, I'm going to offset out right here and type 1 inch. And you're going to notice that as it offsets, it creates a second face right here. I'll then grab the push-pull tool. I'm going to project this up, we'll say another 1 inch right there. So I'm kind of creating a planter here. I've got the cap to that planter, and I want to pull this side in. So I'll hover over this surface right here with my push-pull tool. I'm going to bring it, let's say, just 2 inches in. Now one of the nice things about the push-pull tool is if you double-click on a surface, it repeats the last push-pull distance. So I'm going to double-click here. Not just the distance, but the direction. In my case, it was projecting out away from the object, so I'm double-clicking, and it's going to do that right there. So we created a planter just from a rectangle. You also notice that you have the pencil tool. It allows you to kind of in space create some shapes. Maybe you want to do something that's a little more custom, and you can create that face and push-pull from there. I've also got the selection tool right here. I'm going to if I single click, it just allows me to select the face and delete it. I'll undo that. If I double click, it allows me to select the face and the surrounding edges, so I can delete that, and I can do the same thing here, double click to get the face and the surrounding edges. But you'll notice if I triple click on it, it selects the entire thing. Now you've also noticed that I'm orbiting around, and to do that I'm using a 4-button mouse with a wheel that allows me to roll in and out to zoom. If I push in on that wheel, I can orbit around, and as I push in on the wheel, if I hold shift, I can now pan in that same view. And so you've got a few different options here for sort of navigating. You'll also notice you have those same tools up top. You can click on your orbit tool to kind of use your left click to move around. You've got your pan tool, and again left click here, and your zoom in and out by kind of clicking and moving up to zoom in, down to zoom out, and of course zoom extents. For me, it's much easier to use a 4-button mouse. I'd encourage anyone using SketchUp to actually have that tool handy. You'll find that doing this on a trackpad is way more frustrating. From here, what I'm going to do is actually apply some materials to my planter right here. I could continue to make some modifications, but I think it's going to be good for now. and I'm going to go to Window and Materials. Now this is how it's going to work in a Mac, but if you are on a Windows-based computer in a Windows-based version of SketchUp, what you're going to find is that you have something called the default tray. And in that default tray, you can add and remove different tool sets in here, different windows that I'm going to utilize. And Materials is going to be one of those. So you're going to look for that default tray. It usually is on the right side. You might go to Window and Default Trays up top, and you can toggle those things on and off. So what I'm going to do is click on Window and Materials right here. It's going to open up my materials, and there's a lot of different types of materials. I'm going to start with brick, cladding, and siding right here, and I'm just going to grab a brick and sort of paint this on here. So I click on the material, it auto defaults to this paint bucket right here, which allows me to click, and you got to remember to orb around so you can click on all sides of your objects. I'm going to go to, let's say, asphalt and concrete. We'll just do a simple concrete cap to this right here. And again, clicking on all sides, even the inside edge of this. Orb it up underneath, make sure we get that edge too. And lastly, I'm going to go to, let's say, landscape, and see if I can find maybe a soil or something to paint as sort of this ground plane right here. Now, one of the great things about SketchUp and the SketchUp community is something called the 3D warehouse. And I'm going to go to Window and open up the 3D warehouse here. It's going to open up a dialog. Go ahead and close my materials out. It's going to allow me to search for some different things in here. I'm going to actually search for something called Rudbeckia or Black-Eyed Susan. Type in the common name here. Probably going to be more likely to find things with common names, just as a plant material to put inside of my planter. Now, there's a lot of different options in here, and we'll look, especially when we talk about trees, you'll see 2D versus 3D options, but I'm going to click on this one right here. It looks like a nice 3D option. Now, once I click it, I'm going to actually load it in here. It'll be in my model, and I'm going to grab my Move tool. Anytime I'm moving stuff, I tend to pick it up right at the bottom, right? Don't tend to pick stuff up in the middle. When you try to maybe put it in your planter, you're going to have a hard time locating it, and even if you do, what you'll find is that you're going to place it in that surface right where you picked it up, and sometimes or oftentimes buried in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up from the bottom, zoom out, and then sort of place it right here. And you're going to notice that my Black-Eyed Susans are way too big for this space. So we'll use another tool right here. This is going to be our Scale tool. It allows me to click on these boxes in the corners and sort of resize as I go. I'll then bounce back to my Move tool, and in this case I notice they start pretty high up. I am going to grab a little bit higher on this stem so that I can snap it down to exactly where it needs to go. Now back to the scale, more than just resizing it with a fixed ratio by clicking on the corner, everything sort of moves the same. I can actually click right in the center and kind of make it a little squattier if I needed to. Same thing if I go underneath, and I'd have to really zoom inside there. I could push it up that direction, but grabbing these different grips is going to allow you to distort what you've got to put it in there. I'm going to go back to my Move tool. You're going to notice that, see, I'm a little off center here. It's not always necessary to even click on the object to move it. In fact, sometimes I'm going to grab something out in space so long as I have it selected, right? So I'm going to click off and select this again, go back to my Move tool, and I'm actually going to use the edge of the planter here to move this over to the right. So I'll click on here and reposition, maybe even orbit around, see if I need to move it that direction. So you don't always have to click on the object even to move something. Now at this point I want to talk about two different ways that we can actually copy this around. So you can highlight everything, and what we could do is just simply group this. We could just make a group, and I'm going to click on the bottom of it with my Move tool. I can move it, but then right before I click it, if I hit Option on my Mac or Alt on a PC, it adds a little plus sign to it, and now when I click, I can actually move this. Now when we group things, we make them just independent components. They're now completely separate. I can double click inside of this group, select this, has no effect on this one right here. That's not the case with components. In fact, I'm going to back up to right here. I'm going to right click and explode, which makes it no longer a group. And instead of selecting all of this stuff, just by highlighting it all. I'm actually going to right click and say Make Component. Now, this is a little more advanced. What it's going to allow me to do is I'm going to say Planter for this and click Create. And now as I copy this around, I'll get my Move tool again. I'm clicking this tool up here, hitting Option to make a copy of it. Is I have a version where if I want to adjust the height of the Black Eyed Susans here, I might again click on my corner of this, move up a little bit, and it's actually going to affect both of these because these are components. You can still go back after the fact and say make unique as a component, and so it wouldn't affect the other one. But in this case, this can be really helpful as you're creating repeating elements. Maybe it's a street tree that you want to continue to customize, or a light pole, or anything that's sort of repeating in your SketchUp model. In this case, what I'm going to do is change the material on the surface. So I'll double click on here. I'll go back to my materials, and what I'm going to do is go back to a different type of cladding. In this case, we could say just a different style brick altogether, and I could paint that brick surface on here. What you're going to notice is, even though this is kind of grayed out over here because I'm inside of the component, as I pull off it changes everything. Another thing I'm not a huge fan of is the height of this concrete cap. So what I'm going to do is click inside, grab my push-pull tool, and pull this down, say another inch, just to change the dynamic of that. And what it's going to do is change it for both planners. And so this is how components can be really helpful as you're moving things around the site. You can customize them, change them all together at the same time. Now, the next thing that I want to do is actually use the 3D warehouse to bring in some trees into my SketchUp model. For landscape architects, trees are going to be a huge part of this, and being smart about how you are selecting trees is really important. I'm going to go to the 3D warehouse, and instead of Black Eyed Susan, I'm going to type in 2D tree. Now, when I type in a 2D tree, you're going to see that there's a few different options in here, and some look photorealistic, some look a little more hand-drawn, and having a good idea of how you're going to use your SketchUp model can help you as you're sort of moving through and finding trees. What I'm going to do is, you'll see you can scroll down for quite some time. There's different ways that you can sort. Oftentimes, by default, it's going to sort by relevance, and that can be a really helpful thing, but you might also consider going by popularity. Popularity, or just sort of thinking how many people have downloaded this and included it in their model, can be a helpful way of finding some really good stuff that's proven to be useful in SketchUp models. I'm going to go here, I'm going to grab this redbud tree right here and say OK. As it sort of pulls it into the model, I'm going to click, and you're going to notice that this tree is a 2D plane. You can really see it as you orbit up. You can see that it is just a flat image. But what these objects do is, as you rotate around in the view, they follow with you so that they kind of are always facing at wherever the camera is in the scene. This can be a really helpful tool for first-person perspectives, but it starts to erode away when you do aerial perspectives like this. You can see the Black Eyed Susans look a lot more full, and we can definitely tell that this is just a flat plane of a tree right here. You also might find that there's some objects that have this this outline around them when you bring them in from 3D Warehouse, and if you were to export that with that box, and that's just a dead giveaway that that is an image. So what I might do in here is double click, and we'll click double click on this right here. Once we're inside, it selects both the image and the outlines. I'm going to hold shift to deselect that image. Now I can right click on the lines and just hide those right there. They'll disappear so I don't have those lines. Now, another thing to do that is to go into your styles and adjust the edges for those styles, and you can make it go away that way as well. Now, this is one common type of tree. If you're going to repeat this around a bunch of times, or maybe have it in the background, this is probably going to be your best approach, because other approaches are going to really start to bog down your model the heavier they get. So I'm going to go back to 3D Warehouse, and in this case, we're going to type in 3D tree. What you're going to notice, again, sorting by popularity, you're going to get some really popular options up here. I'm just going to grab this one right here and click the download button, load this directly into your model, say OK, and I'll be able to click this in here. Again, we can use the scale to change the size of it. In this case, I want to make it even bigger. And I'll grab the move tool and sort of move it to the back a little bit there. Now, the big difference here is you can see that this tree is modeled with individual leaves. We've got the trunk and sort of the branching that goes up. It is a much more detailed model and would be great for a small courtyard space or something that is in the front of your first-person perspective right there, just to give a little more detail to it. They also create really dynamic shadows. I'll go ahead and click this on, and you can see that the shadows sometimes for these trees we're going to have to work on to get that to keep it from being a solid square. But in this case, the tree shadow for this 3D tree is really excellent. Now, there's a third type of tree that's lives somewhere in between these. Oftentimes, you'll hear them called 2.5D trees or low poly trees, and they're kind of the best of both worlds. What they do is they give you sort of a depth of the 3D tree without the over complexity of it with so many different lines and models in there. We're going to find a few of those. If I go back to my 3D warehouse, I'm actually going to type in 2D tree. And we'll find that even under 2D tree, you will find that, in this case, this green ash tree, it kind of has one of those, what we call a low poly tree. I'm going to bring it in, and you'll see that it has a fullness about it, much like this 3D tree right here. But as we click inside of this, and all of these are components, you're going to notice that it really is just a bunch of small images with a branching structure that is a 3D tree, but 2D images of the leaves on there. And so that can be a helpful way to kind of get that depth without bogging down your model if you were to model each individual leaf in there. Now, you got to be careful with some of these. They'll come in. You got to make sure you place them right on the ground. So it's always good to confirm. You can see this tree is kind of floating a little higher, and anytime you want to grab the stuff, grab it at that point and sort of bring it down. We can even snap it to the base of the planner and then move it out in space so we know that we're getting it and keeping it from floating up in the air. Now, another great way to search for this these 2.5D trees is going to be in the 3D warehouse. We're just going to actually type in 2.5D trees. Two that I really like are from Tom's Desk. Right here, you're going to see these two sets. I'll bring in one of them now, and we'll place these in the scene. You're going to notice that this tree, obviously much bigger right now, but it has the same approach with these sort of 2D planes. You'll see if I orbit underneath, it doesn't follow, but you can see the branching structure right here with these flat planes. And as I move around the scene, especially get above it, you'll notice that there's sort of a fullness to that tree. And what's important to keep in mind is maybe you just want the tree, you don't want the other stuff that comes with that component. And so double clicking on it, selecting those things, either cutting them out or just deleting them altogether is a helpful way to just get the components that you want. You could right click and again cut that out and paste it outside of the component. But this will be a good way to sort of get a variety of tree types that are going to fit the type of model you're creating. If you've just got a small space, maybe you can get away with just the 3D trees and it won't bog down your computer too much. But maybe if you've got a larger site, you would need to go with one of these 2.5D trees. I'm going to get this and just scale it down to get it a little closer to the size of my model. And I'm going to orbit this way just to have all three in the view. Now, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some shadow settings and then export these as a 2D image. I'm going to put this tree a little bit more in the background, using M as my shortcut for move, and sort of moving it to try and get all these in the same view. And I want to see how the shadows are going to work right here. So we'll go to Window, we'll go to Shadows, and I can actually change the time zone here. I can change the date and time, but really what I'm going to need to do is toggle on my shadow settings. In this dialog, I just click on this box right here. It's going to project those shadows. You can see that as you change the date, as you change the time, the shadows are going to kind of move around. So choose the one that's going to best highlight your view in here. Again, I'm going to need to make some tweaks to this tree so that I don't get that solid rectangle shadow right here. So I'm going to click that and go ahead and just take it out of the scene. But I might fiddle with these just to get the right shadow approach here. So you can also play with the lights and darks. There's numerous settings in there, and I've got my shortcut right here to toggle these on and off. Once you feel like you've got something that you like, you're going to go to Window and Scenes. This will be our last thing as we're sort of setting this up to export. and I'm going to create a few scenes. So I've got this view right here. I'm going to go ahead and click this plus sign. It's going to save it as scene 1. You can click on these and rename these. I'm going to say FP1 for first person perspective 1, and just hit the tab button to go to the description. You could add a little more description. Now I have all of these things toggled on: the camera location, the style, the shadows and settings, different things like this. You don't necessarily have to have all of them saved when you do this. In fact, some people will save a scene that really doesn't have the camera location. It just is rotates between different styles in there, and that's perfectly acceptable. I'm going to zoom in a little closer, do what we call a worm's eye view right here, where I get a little lower in the scene and get this view right here. I'll hit the plus again to save this scene. You can also zoom out. We'll grab our person right here. This always gets us, puts our camera right at, and I'm going to stick it right at the base of this person here, and we can kind of look around to see more or less what they're seeing right here. It tells us what the height is, the eye height. So in this case, about 5 foot eye height, which would be for a person about 5'4", and they can look around and see. And so if you have a flat surface, maybe you need to create a ground plane for your model. You can actually grab this person and drop them right here. It defaults to the eye as the next tool, and you can sort of just pan around and look to get a better view of that scene. We'll do one more scene that we're going to add right here. Now the last thing that we're going to do is get in here, and I'm going to delete this plane. Is I'm going to go to export this as a 2D graphic, and you can do animations in here as well, but we're just going to simplify it to a 2D graphic. I'm going to go to File, Export, and 2D Graphic right here. So I'm going to export this scene, and we have options to save it as different exports. I'm going to just do a JPEG, and I'm going to click on Options. This allows me to change the pixel amount. I can actually change to inches right here. Whatever these are going to be. Again, you can use the view size, and it's just your monitor, but bumping this up to a higher number is going to give you a higher resolution. And again, you can play with these settings right here. I'll just go straight to my desktop. We'll name it FP3 for our third first person perspective. We'll say export, and it's going to send it to the desktop. If I look over here, double click on this, and you can see that view right there. So this is obviously some very basic tools for getting started in SketchUp. The 3D Warehouse can be a really powerful tool for getting some stuff, but at the same time, you got to be careful. There's a lot of helpful things up there. There's also a lot of stuff that is poorly made or poorly constructed, out of scale, out of proportion. And really, even just grabbing a lot of things and bringing them into the same SketchUp model can create sort of an eclectic weirdness about that model. And what I'd encourage you to do as you're working on these, have a design approach, have a method going into it, know what you want to work through. Resist the urge to design entirely in SketchUp until you are really well versed in the tools. Otherwise, you're going to find that it sort of dumbs down the approach to the project that you're working on. YouTube is going to be a great place for finding a bunch of tutorials that are going to help you take some of the topics discussed in here and take them a lot further, learning some more advanced tools and tricks in SketchUp. But hopefully this will just give you a jump start as you're getting accustomed to SketchUp.